My name is Clara. I am 28 years old. On the exact day I graduated from one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, I sat in a massive stadium surrounded by 10,000 cheering parents, holding a text message from my mother that made my blood run completely cold. I looked out at the massive ocean of proud families holding bouquets of flowers and painting colorful signs, and I found my 4 allotted VIP seats in the front row. They were completely empty. My parents, David and Valerie, had decided to skip my hooding ceremony. They did not miss it because of a medical emergency or a canceled flight. They deliberately skipped my medical school graduation to take my younger sister Tiffany on a luxury Caribbean cruise to celebrate her reaching 10,000 followers on her lifestyle social media page. As I sat there suffocating in my heavy velvet regalia, blinking back tears of absolute humiliation, and listening to the deafening cheers of strangers, my phone buzzed with a message sent from the cruise ship premium internet. It read, "Have fun today, Clara. We are drinking margaritas by the pool. Do not be too dramatic about us missing the ceremony. It is not like you are really a doctor yet anyway, since you still have residency." I thought I was going to quietly swallow that insult, just like I had swallowed every other insult for the past 28 years. I thought my family was going to get away with entirely erasing my existence once again. But then the keynote speaker stepped up to the podium. Her name was Dr. Caroline Pierce, a world-renowned pediatric surgeon and a woman who absolutely did not tolerate fools. She looked at the 10,000 people in the stadium crowd. She looked directly at the cameras broadcasting the official live stream to thousands more online. She slowly folded up her prepared speech, leaned into the microphone, and did something that caused my family's entire fake reality to violently and publicly implode. She called them out by their full names on a live broadcast. Within 30 seconds, my phone started exploding with panicked calls from relatives. Before I tell you exactly what Dr. Pierce said to that massive crowd and how it permanently destroyed my parents' social standing, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely love stories about toxic families getting the exact public karma they deserve. Also, drop a comment right now and let me know where in the world you are watching from today. Now let me take you back to the affluent suburbs of Seattle to show you exactly how this nightmare started. Growing up in a wealthy, heavily manicured suburb of Seattle, my family operated on a very strict, completely unspoken point system. My father, David, was a high-level corporate consultant who viewed our family exactly like a stock portfolio. He only invested time and affection into the assets that yielded the highest public return. My mother, Valerie, was a woman entirely consumed by the brutal politics of our local neighborhood association and her exclusive country club. To them, optics were the only currency that actually mattered. And sitting comfortably at the absolute pinnacle of their twisted value system was my younger sister, Tiffany. Tiffany was exactly the kind of daughter my parents wanted to showcase. She had perfect blonde hair, a loud, bubbly cheerleader charisma, and an endless appetite for attention. She was not particularly intelligent, and she lacked any real work ethic. But in my house, those were considered minor details. Everything Tiffany did was treated like a monumental Olympic-level achievement. I, on the other hand, was treated like an annoying administrative error. I was quiet, deeply academic, and entirely uninterested in the shallow social climbing that my mother obsessed over. I want to give you a specific example so you can truly understand the environment I was trapped in. When I was 16 and Tiffany was 14, she entered the local middle school talent show. She performed a highly choreographed, slightly off-key pop vocal routine. She won 3rd place. Not first, 3rd. When they announced her name, my father actually stood up in the middle of the crowded auditorium and cheered so loudly his face turned red. The very next evening, he rented out the entire back room of an expensive Italian restaurant downtown just to celebrate her bronze ribbon. He invited 24 family friends, bought a massive custom cake with her face printed on it and frosting, and gave a 5-minute toast about how Tiffany was destined for absolute stardom. I sat at the very end of that long table, quietly eating my pasta, completely ignored by everyone. Exactly 2 years later, it was my turn to achieve something. I had poured every single ounce of my energy into my academics. I knew that education was my only viable escape route from their suffocating favoritism. I graduated from our highly competitive high school as the undisputed valedictorian. I had a perfect grade point average, flawless test scores, and I had secured a full-ride academic scholarship for my undergraduate degree. During the graduation ceremony, I stood at the podium in front of 2,000 people and delivered the valedictorian address. I spoke about resilience, hard work, and looking toward the future. When the ceremony ended, I walked off the football field, clutching my diploma, desperately hoping that my parents would finally look at me with the same pride they reserved for Tiffany. I found them standing near the bleachers. My father was checking his work emails on his phone. My mother was adjusting her expensive designer sunglasses. When I walked up to them, my mother did not hug me. She did not say, "Congratulations." She just sighed heavily and said, "Clara, your speech was incredibly long. You used so many big words that it honestly made people bored. Next time, try to be a little more entertaining, like your sister." Tiffany, who had barely passed her sophomore math class, just smirked and patted my shoulder condescendingly. They did not take me to an expensive Italian restaurant. We drove home in complete silence, and I ate leftover cold chicken out of the refrigerator for dinner while they watched television in the living room. That night, sitting alone in my dark bedroom, I made a silent vow. I realized that shrinking myself to make them comfortable was never going to earn their love. So I decided to do the exact opposite. I decided to aim so high that they would be absolutely forced to acknowledge my existence. I wanted to become a pediatric surgeon. I threw myself into my undergraduate pre-medical studies with a level of dedication that bordered on pure obsession. I volunteered at the local children's hospital. I joined grueling research labs. And I spent my weekends memorizing thick organic chemistry textbooks. While I was pulling all-nighters in the university library, Tiffany was dropping out of her local community college after just one single semester. She announced that traditional education was blocking her creative energy and that she was going to become a lifestyle influencer on social media. My parents completely supported her delusion. They bought her thousands of dollars worth of professional camera equipment, professional lighting rings, and designer clothes, just so she could take pictures of herself drinking iced coffee at expensive cafes. They funded her entire existence, paying her rent and her car insurance, while I worked a grueling part-time job at a campus coffee shop just to afford my basic biology lab fees. I convinced myself that getting into a prestigious medical school would be the ultimate, undeniable proof of my worth. I thought it was the one achievement they could not possibly ignore or belittle. I survived the brutal gauntlet of the medical college admission test and the exhausting travel of the medical school interview circuits. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early spring, I received an email from one of the top 5 medical programs in the entire country. It was an official letter of acceptance. I was so incredibly happy I actually fell to my knees in my tiny off-campus apartment and cried tears of pure joy. All the sleepless nights and all the sacrifices had finally paid off. I immediately printed the letter on nice, heavy paper. I bought a nice bottle of wine with the last $20 in my checking account, and I drove straight to my parents' house for Sunday dinner. I walked through the front door, smelling the roast my mother was cooking in the kitchen, feeling like I had finally conquered the world. I thought I was about to experience the family celebration I had been waiting 22 years for. I thought they would finally look at me and see someone valuable. I waited until we were all seated at the mahogany dining room table. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I handed the pristine acceptance letter to my father, expecting a massive hug and a proud toast. But instead of throwing a party, my parents enacted a financial betrayal so incredibly deep, and so utterly devastating that it almost destroyed my entire future before it even began. I sat at the mahogany dining room table, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the perfect moment. The house smelled of expensive pot roast and red wine. My father, David, was sitting at the head of the table, cutting his meat with the precise, aggressive motions of a man who was used to dissecting corporate competitors. My mother, Valerie, was gossiping about a woman at her country club who had worn the wrong shade of white to a charity luncheon. Tiffany was entirely ignoring the conversation, aggressively typing on her phone and occasionally sighing loudly to ensure everyone knew how busy and important she was. When the dinner plates were finally cleared, I reached into my bag and pulled out the crisp, cream-colored folder. Inside was the official acceptance letter to one of the most elite medical schools in the country, along with the standard financial aid packet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and slid the folder directly across the polished wood until it rested right next to my father's wine glass. Medical school in the United States is notoriously expensive. It is a financial mountain that is almost impossible to climb without significant help. Even with the partial academic scholarships I had fiercely negotiated, the remaining tuition, laboratory fees, and basic living expenses required substantial graduate loans. Because I was 22 years old and had spent my entire adult life as a full-time student working minimum wage jobs just to survive, I did not have the established credit history required to secure those massive loans entirely on my own. I needed a parental co-signer. I want to make this absolutely clear. I was not asking my parents for cash. I was not asking them to drain their savings to pay my tuition. I was simply asking them to attach their excellent, heavily guarded credit score to my application so I could legally secure the funding I needed. My father looked down at the folder. He did not open it. He did not even touch it. He just stared at the embossed medical school logo on the cover, his expression completely unreadable. Then he picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth slowly, and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "What is this exactly, Clara?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "It is my acceptance letter to medical school," I said, a massive, genuine smile breaking across my face despite my anxiety. "I got in. I am going to be a pediatric surgeon, and the forms behind the letter are just for the federal and private graduate loans. I just need you to co-sign them so the bank will release the funds before the fall semester begins." For a moment, the room was completely silent. I waited for the smile. I waited for my mother to gasp in delight. I waited for my father to stand up and tell me how proud he was that his daughter had achieved something so monumental. Instead, my father casually pushed the folder back across the table with his index finger. It slid across the polished wood and stopped directly in front of me, entirely unopened. "We cannot take on this kind of financial liability, Clara," he said smoothly, speaking to me as if I were a junior employee pitching a bad marketing campaign. "Your mother and I have spent the last few weeks reviewing our financial portfolio, and co-signing a loan of this magnitude is simply too much risk for us right now. You are going to have to defer your enrollment for a few years until you can afford it yourself, or you need to find a significantly cheaper career path." I stared at him, my brain completely unable to process what he was saying. "Risk?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "Dad, it is not a risk. I am going to be a doctor. I will pay back every single penny of those loans myself the second I finish my residency. I just need your signature to get through the door. If I do not secure this funding by next month, I lose my seat in the program. I lose everything I have worked for over the last 4 years." My mother sighed heavily, swirling her wine glass. "Do not raise your voice at your father, Clara," she scolded, her tone dripping with annoyance. "You are being incredibly selfish right now. You only think about yourself and your expensive little school projects. You need to understand that this family has other priorities right now." I looked at my mother in absolute disbelief. "Other priorities?" I echoed. What could possibly be a higher priority than your daughter getting into one of the best medical schools in the country? Tiffany finally looked up from her phone. She offered me a bright, deeply condescending smile. "Well, since you asked," she chirped, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder, "I am officially launching my new lifestyle and wellness boutique online next month. It is going to be a massive lifestyle brand. I'm going to sell curated aesthetic home goods and wellness supplements to my followers, and Mom and Dad are the primary investors." My father nodded proudly, puffing out his chest. "That is correct," he stated. "We have decided to liquidate some of our assets to give your sister the $50,000 seed money she needs to properly launch her brand. Starting a business requires significant upfront capital, Clara. We are setting Tiffany up for long-term entrepreneurial success. Therefore, our credit and our cash are completely tied up. We cannot help you." I sat completely frozen in my chair. The air in the dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could not breathe. I looked at the three of them sitting there, so incredibly smug, so entirely convinced of their own twisted logic. They were literally willing to hand my sister $50,000 in cold, hard cash for a doomed vanity project boutique that she would inevitably abandon in 6 months. But they absolutely refused to simply sign their names on a piece of paper to guarantee my medical degree. They were willing to fund her delusions, but they considered my actual, tangible genius to be a financial liability. It was not about the money. It was never about the money. It was about control. It was about making sure I never outshined their golden child. I did not scream. I did not cry. I slowly picked up the cream-colored folder, put it back into my bag, and stood up from the table. "I understand," I said quietly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, entirely hollow and completely dead. "I understand exactly what my place is in this family." I walked out of their house that Sunday evening, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was entirely on my own. I had no safety net. I had no family backing. If I wanted to become a surgeon, I was going to have to walk through absolute hell to get there. The next morning, I went to the financial aid office and did what thousands of desperate, unsupported students are forced to do every single year. I applied for predatory, high-interest private student loans that did not require a cosigner. The interest rates were absolutely astronomical. I was practically signing my entire financial future away to the banks, but I did not care. I needed that seat in the medical program. But the loans only covered my tuition. They did not cover my rent, my expensive medical textbooks, my laboratory equipment, or my groceries. I needed a massive source of income that I could work around my grueling medical school schedule. So I applied for a job as an overnight emergency medical technician. For the first 2 years of medical school, my life became a brutal, unforgiving nightmare of sheer endurance. While my wealthy classmates spent their weekends taking ski trips to Aspen and studying in expensive off-campus lofts paid for by their parents, I was living in a state of constant, agonizing exhaustion. My alarm would go off at 6 in the morning. I would attend intense medical lectures, anatomy labs, and clinical simulations until 5 in the evening. Then I would rush back to my tiny, cramped apartment, sleep for exactly 3 hours, and wake up at 8:30 at night to put on my heavy navy blue EMT uniform and steel-toed boots. I worked the overnight ambulance shift from 9 at night until 5 in the morning. I saw the absolute worst parts of the city during those overnight shifts. I dealt with horrific car accidents, violent traumas, and heartbreaking medical emergencies. My uniform constantly smelled of harsh hospital antiseptic, stale coffee, and sweat. During the rare, quiet hours of the night when the radio was silent, I would sit in the back of the freezing ambulance under the flickering fluorescent lights, frantically flipping through my organic chemistry and advanced anatomy flashcards. I was surviving on vending machine coffee and sheer, desperate adrenaline. I lost weight. There were permanent, dark purple bags under my eyes. I was entirely alienated from my medical school peers because I never had the time or the money to socialize with them. I was a ghost, haunting the lecture halls by day and the city streets by night. The physical and mental toll was absolutely devastating. I was pushing my body entirely past its natural limits, and I knew I was dangerously close to completely burning out. I would sometimes stand in the shower after an overnight shift, letting the hot water wash the grime off my skin, and just cry from the sheer, overwhelming weight of the exhaustion. But every time I thought about quitting, every time I thought about calling my father and admitting defeat, I remembered his smug face at the dining room table. I remembered Tiffany bragging about her $50,000 boutique, and that rage fueled me for another day. The breaking point finally arrived during the winter of my second year. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on a brutal Tuesday. My ambulance had just dropped off a severe trauma patient at the region's largest teaching hospital. I was completely covered in sweat. My hands were shaking from an adrenaline crash, and I had a massive pharmacology exam in exactly 4 hours. I stumbled into the hospital's surgical trauma break room, a quiet area usually reserved for attending physicians. I just needed 10 minutes of silence. I sat down at a small table, opened my massive pharmacology textbook, and tried to force my blurry eyes to focus on the cellular pathways. But my body simply gave up. My head dropped forward, resting entirely on the open textbook, and I instantly fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. I do not know how long I was out, but I woke up with a sharp jolt, feeling the distinct, heavy presence of someone standing directly over me. I rubbed my eyes, panicking that I was about to be fired or written up for sleeping in a restricted area. I looked up, and the blood froze in my veins. Standing on the other side of the small break room table, holding a steaming cup of black coffee and looking down at me with an expression of intense, terrifying scrutiny, was the most intimidating figure in the entire hospital. It was a moment that would entirely alter the trajectory of my career and introduce me to the family I actually deserved. I stared up into the eyes of Dr. Caroline Pierce. If you do not know who Dr. Pierce is, you need to understand that she was an absolute legend in the medical community. She was the head of pediatric surgery at the hospital, a woman who literally wrote the textbooks we were studying, and she possessed a reputation for being brilliantly terrifying. She did not tolerate incompetence. She fired residents for being 5 minutes late. She was intimidating, demanding, and commanded absolute respect from every single person who walked the hospital halls. And she was currently staring down at me while I drooled on a pharmacology textbook in a restricted break room at 4 o'clock in the morning. I scrambled out of the chair so fast I nearly knocked the small table over. My heart was hammering in my throat. I frantically tried to smooth down my wrinkled EMT uniform, absolutely certain that my medical career was completely over before it had even begun. "I am so sorry, Dr. Pierce," I stammered, my voice shaking. "I just finished a trauma transport and I had an exam in a few hours. I just needed to sit down for a second. I will leave right now." Dr. Pierce did not blink. She did not yell. She just slowly lowered her coffee cup and looked at the massive open textbook on the table. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the page I had been sleeping on. "Explain the exact cellular pathway and mechanism of action for a beta-1 adrenergic receptor antagonist in the context of a pediatric patient experiencing tachycardia," she commanded, her voice sharp and completely serious. My brain completely blanked for a fraction of a second, completely paralyzed by fear. But then, the thousands of hours I had spent studying in the freezing back of the ambulance kicked in. The adrenaline forced my mind into total focus. I took a deep breath and recited the pathway flawlessly. I detailed the competitive binding, the reduction in intracellular cyclic AMP, the decrease in calcium ion influx, and the ultimate negative chronotropic effect on the heart muscle. I spoke for 2 full minutes without stopping, my voice growing steadier with every single word. When I finished, the small break room was completely silent. I waited for her to tell me to pack up my things and get out of her hospital. Instead, the absolute faintest hint of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. She looked me up and down, taking in my heavy boots, my dark under-eye circles, and my oversized uniform. "Why is a second-year medical student working a full-time overnight ambulance shift?" she asked. "Because I have to pay my own way," I answered honestly. I did not whine. I did not complain about my parents or my sister. I simply stated the facts. I do not have a cosigner for federal loans, so I took out high-interest private loans for tuition. The ambulance job pays my rent and buys my textbooks. Dr. Pierce stared at me for a long, calculating moment. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Come to my office on the 7th floor at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, Evans. Do not be late." Then she turned around and walked out of the break room, leaving me standing there completely stunned. I took my pharmacology exam later that morning and scored a 98%. At exactly 2 minutes to 3 o'clock, having changed out of my EMT uniform and into professional clothes, I knocked on the heavy wooden door of the head of pediatric surgery. Dr. Pierce told me to enter. She was sitting behind a massive glass desk, surrounded by medical awards and framed research publications. She motioned for me to sit down. "I pulled your academic file this morning, Clara," she began, folding her hands on her desk. "You are currently ranked 3rd in your class. Your professors say you are brilliant, but completely alienated from your peers because you are always working. Your clinical scores are flawless, but you are physically deteriorating. I can see the exhaustion in your eyes. If you keep working overnight shifts on an ambulance, you are going to burn out before you ever reach a surgical residency. And that would be a massive waste of your talent." I looked down at my hands. "I know," I whispered, "but I do not have a choice." "You do now," Dr. Pierce said smoothly. "I am currently running a massive clinical research trial on congenital heart defects. I need a dedicated, highly intelligent research assistant who can handle complex data and is not afraid of hard work. The position comes with a substantial hospital stipend. It pays more than double what you are making as an EMT, and the hours are entirely flexible around your medical school schedule. I am offering you the job. I want you to quit the ambulance company today." I sat there in the leather guest chair, completely unable to process the magnitude of what she was handing me. My parents, the people who shared my DNA, the people who were supposed to protect and provide for me, had refused to sign a simple piece of paper to help me. They had abandoned me to fund my sister's fake internet boutique. And here was a complete stranger, a world-renowned surgeon, throwing me a massive lifeline simply because she recognized my hard work. The sheer, overwhelming relief crashed into me like a tidal wave. I covered my face with my hands and began to cry. I could not stop the tears. I cried for the exhaustion, for the fear, and for the profound gratitude I felt in that exact moment. Dr. Pierce handed me a box of tissues. She did not coddle me, but her eyes were incredibly kind. "Take the weekend to sleep, Clara," she said softly. "I expect to see you in the research lab on Monday morning." That day changed the entire trajectory of my life. I quit my ambulance job and started working for Dr. Pierce. Over the next 2 years, she became so much more than a boss or a mentor. She became the mother figure I had spent my entire life desperately craving. She pushed me relentlessly in the academic setting, teaching me how to think like a world-class surgeon. But she also genuinely cared about my well-being. When I forgot to eat lunch because I was studying too hard, she would casually drop a sandwich on my desk. When I aced my surgical rotations, she took me out to an expensive dinner to celebrate, listening to my dreams and treating my ambition like a precious gift instead of an annoying burden. With the crushing weight of financial panic and physical exhaustion finally lifted off my shoulders, my academic performance skyrocketed. I moved from 3rd in my class to absolute 1st. I became the undisputed top medical student in my cohort. By my final year, I had secured a highly coveted pediatric surgical residency at one of the premier hospitals on the West Coast. I had built a beautiful, fiercely protective circle of friends in my medical program. I had built a life I was incredibly proud of. I had found my chosen family. But trauma is a very complicated thing. Despite all my massive success, despite having the respect of the greatest surgeon in the hospital, there was still a tiny, deeply broken inner child inside of me that desperately wanted her biological parents to love her. I wanted my father to look at me the way he looked at Tiffany when she won 3rd place in a middle school talent show. I wanted my mother to brag about me to her country club friends. I thought that if they could just see me walk across that massive stage wearing the heavy velvet regalia of a doctor of medicine, graduating at the absolute top of my class, they would finally wake up. I thought they would finally realize what they had been missing. Graduation was approaching in late May. As the valedictorian of the medical school class, I was given 4 VIP front row tickets to the hooding ceremony in the massive university stadium. I held those 4 glossy tickets in my hands for days, debating what to do. My friends told me to give them to people who actually supported me. Dr. Pierce told me to protect my peace. But the hope of a daughter seeking her parents' approval is a very difficult thing to kill. I bought a beautiful, expensive card. I carefully placed the 4 VIP tickets inside. I wrote a long, heartfelt letter to my parents. I told them about my residency match. I told them that despite everything that had happened with the loans, I still wanted them to be there to share the most important day of my life. I mailed the package to their house in Seattle, and I waited. For an entire week, I heard absolutely nothing. No phone call, no text message. I convinced myself they were just figuring out their travel arrangements. I convinced myself they were planning a surprise dinner to celebrate my achievement. Then, exactly 10 days before my graduation ceremony, my phone rang. It was my mother. She sounded incredibly excited, her voice practically vibrating with energy. "Clara," she chirped, "we received your little invitation in the mail. Listen, your father and I are flying you back to Seattle this weekend. We are hosting a massive family dinner at the country club on Saturday night, and your attendance is absolutely mandatory." My heart soared. My hands actually started shaking with happiness. They were throwing me a party. They were flying me home to celebrate my medical degree in front of the entire family. After 26 years of being the invisible scapegoat, I was finally going to get my moment in the sun. I immediately booked the flight, packed a nice dress, and flew home to Seattle, completely oblivious to the fact that I was walking directly into a massive, heartbreaking trap. I arrived at the country club on Saturday night, expecting to see congratulations banners or maybe a cake with a stethoscope on it. But when I walked into the private dining room, there was no mention of my graduation at all. Instead, the room was decorated with massive silver balloons, spelling out the number 10,000. My parents were beaming. Tiffany was wearing a glittering cocktail dress, holding a glass of champagne, and soaking in the applause of 20 of our closest relatives. I took my seat at the table, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I realized very quickly that this dinner had absolutely nothing to do with me becoming a surgeon. And when my mother stood up to make her grand announcement, she delivered the ultimate, unapologetic insult that finally shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I walked into the private dining room of the Seattle Country Club, expecting to find a celebration of my medical degree. I was wearing a brand new dress I had bought specifically for this occasion. I had spent the entire flight from California to Washington imagining how my parents would finally introduce me to our extended family. I imagined my father putting his arm around my shoulder and calling me Dr. Evans for the very first time. I imagined my mother telling her wealthy friends about my highly competitive pediatric surgical residency. But the universe has a very cruel way of correcting your naive expectations. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining suite, the first thing I saw was not a banner congratulating me. I saw massive, glittering silver balloons floating near the ceiling. They spelled out the number 10,000. The room was packed with about 20 of our closest relatives and family friends. My mother was rushing around ordering the catering staff to pour more expensive champagne. My father was holding court near the private bar, laughing loudly with his corporate partners. And sitting in the absolute center of the room wearing a stunning designer cocktail dress and holding a professional ring light, was my sister, Tiffany. I stood in the doorway completely frozen. I looked at the balloons. 10,000. It made absolutely no sense. Nobody was turning 10. Nobody was turning 100. I slowly walked into the room and approached my Aunt Sarah, who was sipping a martini near the entrance. "What are we celebrating?" I asked quietly, my heart sinking heavily into my stomach. Aunt Sarah looked at me with a bright, entirely genuine smile. "Oh, Clara, you made it," she said happily. "We are celebrating Tiffany. She finally hit 10,000 followers on her lifestyle social media page this morning. Your mother organized this entire dinner at the last minute to surprise her. Is it not just wonderful how her little internet boutique is taking off?" I felt physically sick. I looked across the room at my parents. They had received my graduation invitation in the mail. They knew I had graduated at the top of my medical school class. They had flown me home under the guise of a mandatory family dinner. And they had done it all to use me as a background prop for a party celebrating my sister getting 10,000 strangers to look at her pictures on the internet. I did not cause a scene. I walked over to the assigned seating and took my place at the far end of the long dining table. I sat there in complete silence while the waiters served expensive filet mignon and imported truffles. I watched my relatives fawn over Tiffany, asking her about her skincare routines and her aesthetic photography tips. Not a single person asked me about medical school. Not a single person mentioned my graduation. My parents had clearly not told anyone why I was actually flying home. When the dessert plates were finally cleared, my mother Valerie stood up at the head of the table. She tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, demanding absolute silence from the room. She was practically glowing with pride. She looked at Tiffany with a level of adoration I had never experienced in my entire life. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," my mother began, her voice echoing in the private room. "Today is a monumental day for the Evans family. Building a brand from scratch takes incredible dedication, late nights, and an absolute commitment to excellence. Tiffany has poured her heart and soul into her lifestyle page, and today she officially reached 10,000 followers. She is officially an influencer." The room erupted into loud applause. Tiffany blushed and blew kisses to the relatives. I stared down at my hands, my fingernails digging so hard into my palms that they were leaving deep crescent-shaped marks. But my mother was not finished. She held up her hand to quiet the room. "Because we are so incredibly proud of her massive achievement, your father and I decided that a simple dinner was not enough. We wanted to do something truly unforgettable. So, to celebrate Tiffany reaching this milestone, we have officially booked a 10-day, all-expenses-paid luxury cruise to the Bahamas for the three of us. We leave this Thursday." The applause started again, but I could not hear it. The blood was rushing in my ears so loudly it sounded like a roaring ocean. I stared at my mother, completely unable to process what she had just said. Thursday. They were leaving on Thursday for a 10-day cruise. My graduation ceremony, the hooding ceremony, where I would officially receive my doctorate of medicine in front of 10,000 people, was on Friday. I stood up from the table. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting violently through the applause. The entire room went completely silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. My mother lowered her champagne glass, an expression of deep annoyance crossing her face. "Clara," she scolded softly, "please sit down. You are interrupting the toast." "The cruise leaves on Thursday," I said, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I looked directly at my father. He was staring at me with a completely blank expression. "My medical school graduation is on Friday. You have the VIP tickets. I mailed them to you last week." My father sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked around the room at the relatives, playing the role of the patient, long-suffering parent dealing with a dramatic child. "Clara, please do not make this about you," he said smoothly. "We received your little tickets, but we had to make a choice. Tiffany has worked incredibly hard for her brand, and she desperately needs high-quality beach content for her page to keep her follower momentum going. The cruise was only available for these specific dates. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. "You are skipping my medical school graduation?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The graduation I worked 4 years for? The degree I paid for myself by working overnight on an ambulance because you refused to help me. You are skipping it so Tiffany can take pictures on a beach." Tiffany rolled her eyes dramatically from across the table. "Oh my God, Clara, stop being such a victim," she whined. "It is just a stupid ceremony. You are literally just going to put on a boring robe, walk across a stage, and get a piece of paper. It is not a big deal." My father nodded in absolute agreement. "Your sister is right," he stated coldly. "It is just a formality. You already know you passed your classes. We will take you out to a nice dinner when we get back from the Bahamas. Now please, sit down and stop ruining your sister's special night." I looked at the relatives sitting around the table. Aunt Sarah looked slightly uncomfortable, staring down at her napkin. Uncle David was clearing his throat nervously. But nobody said a single word to defend me. Nobody pointed out the absolute staggering insanity of celebrating an internet milestone over a medical doctorate. I did not scream. I did not throw my champagne glass. I simply experienced a moment of total, profound clarity. I finally understood that there was absolutely nothing I could ever do to make these people love me. If becoming a top-tier surgeon was not enough to earn their respect, then nothing ever would be. The hope that had kept me returning to them for 26 years completely died right there in that country club dining room. I grabbed my purse from the back of my chair. "I hope you have a wonderful cruise," I said softly. I turned around and walked out of the private dining room, leaving them to their ridiculous balloons and their fake reality. I took a taxi straight to the airport, changed my flight, and flew back to California that exact same night. I did not speak to them for the rest of the week. I completely shut off my emotions and focused entirely on preparing for my graduation. Fast forward to exactly 1 week later. It was a bright, beautiful Friday morning. I was sitting in the front row of the massive university athletics stadium. I was wearing my heavy velvet doctoral regalia, the dark green fabric draped over my shoulders, signifying my degree in medicine. The stadium was absolutely packed with 10,000 cheering family members. There were parents holding massive bouquets of flowers, grandparents crying tears of joy, and siblings holding up colorful, handmade signs. The air was buzzing with an overwhelming sense of pride and celebration. And right in the middle of all that massive, suffocating joy, I was sitting entirely alone. I looked at the 4 VIP seats directly to my left. They were completely empty. My parents had not sold them. They had not given them away. They had just left them empty, a glaring, physical reminder of my complete lack of value to them. While the university president was giving his opening remarks, I felt my phone buzz in the pocket of my dress beneath my heavy robe. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my mother, sent via the expensive premium internet package on their luxury cruise ship. I opened the message. It read, "Have fun today, Clara. We are drinking margaritas by the pool. The weather here is absolutely perfect. Do not be too dramatic about us missing the ceremony today. It is not like you are really a doctor yet anyway, since you still have to finish your residency. Tiffany says hi." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I read the words over and over again. It is not like you are really a doctor yet. They could not just abandon me. They had to actively diminish my achievement, even while they were thousands of miles away. They had to make sure I felt small. I locked my phone, slid it back into my pocket, and closed my eyes. I took a deep, shaky breath, fighting with absolutely everything I had to keep the tears from spilling over and ruining my makeup. I told myself I was going to quietly swallow this humiliation. I told myself I would just walk across the stage, take my diploma, and disappear into my residency without ever looking back. But I had completely forgotten who was scheduled to deliver the keynote address that morning. The stadium loudspeakers crackled to life. The dean of the medical school stepped up to the podium and announced our keynote speaker. Please welcome the head of pediatric surgery, an absolute pioneer in the medical field and a mentor to so many of our graduating students today, Dr. Caroline Pierce. The stadium erupted into massive applause. I opened my eyes and watched Dr. Pierce walk confidently across the grand stage. She was wearing her own pristine academic regalia. She carried a leather portfolio containing the speech she had been preparing for weeks. A speech about the future of medicine, the ethical responsibilities of being a physician, and the incredible technological advancements awaiting our generation. She reached the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. The massive, high-definition stadium cameras zoomed in on her face, broadcasting her image to the giant jumbo screens above the field and to the thousands of people watching the official live stream online. Dr. Pierce opened her leather portfolio. She looked down at her carefully typed notes, and then she stopped. She looked up from the paper. She scanned the front row of the graduating class until her eyes locked entirely onto me. She looked at the 4 glaringly empty VIP seats directly next to me. I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated fury cross her face. It was the exact same terrifying look she gave to arrogant surgical residents who made critical errors in her operating room. Dr. Pierce slowly closed her leather portfolio. She pushed it to the side of the podium. She leaned forward into the microphone, looking directly into the main broadcasting camera, and began a speech that was about to set my family's entire world completely on fire. Dr. Caroline Pierce stood at the heavy wooden podium in the absolute center of the massive university stadium. The bright spring sun was beating down on the thousands of graduating students in their dark green velvet regalia. The energy in the air was electric, thick with anticipation, and the proud murmurs of 10,000 family members sitting in the grandstands. Dr. Pierce adjusted the microphone. The high-pitched feedback whined for a fraction of a second, and then the entire stadium went completely silent. She looked out at the massive crowd, her eyes scanning the front row until they locked directly onto me. She looked at the 4 glaringly empty chairs to my left. I watched as she slowly closed her leather portfolio. She pushed it entirely to the side of the podium. She did not look at her prepared notes. She leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium, and looked directly into the main broadcasting camera that was streaming the ceremony to thousands of viewers online. I had a speech prepared for you today, Dr. Pierce began, her voice deep, commanding, and echoing perfectly through the stadium speakers. I was going to talk to you about the future of medicine. I was going to talk about the ethical responsibilities of wearing the white coat, the technological advancements waiting for your generation, and the incredible privilege it is to save human lives. But as I stand here looking at this graduating class, I realize that giving a standard, comfortable speech would be a disservice to the actual reality of what it takes to sit in those chairs. A murmur rippled through the faculty seated behind her on the stage. The dean of the medical school looked slightly nervous, shifting in his seat. Keynote speakers at prestigious universities did not usually go off script, but Dr. Pierce was untouchable, and she did exactly what she wanted. Today she continued, her voice slicing through the warm spring air with absolute surgical precision. I want to talk about sacrifice. We look at a graduating medical student and we see the triumph. We see the flawless test scores, the successful clinical rotations, and the prestige of the degree. What we do not see are the invisible scars. We do not see the crushing weight of the obstacles that some of these brilliant minds had to overcome just to survive. I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck. My heart started to beat a little faster. I had no idea where she was going with this, but the intensity in her eyes made it clear that she was incredibly angry. I want to tell you a story about one specific student graduating in the front row today, Dr. Pierce said, her gaze sweeping across the audience before returning to the camera. 4 years ago, this student was accepted into this elite program based entirely on her own undeniable merit. She had the grades, she had the drive. She simply needed a parental signature to secure her graduate loans. Not money, just a signature. But her parents looked her in the eye and refused. They told her she was a financial liability. They refused to co-sign her loans because they had decided to take $50,000 of their liquid assets and give it to their younger daughter to start a fake internet lifestyle boutique. The stadium was so quiet, you could hear the flags snapping in the wind. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the thousands of parents sitting in the bleachers. The people sitting directly behind me started whispering frantically. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I was paralyzed. I could not believe she was actually saying this out loud. Because her family completely abandoned her financially, Dr. Pierce continued, her voice rising in power and righteous indignation, this brilliant student was forced to take out predatory, high-interest loans just to pay her tuition. But that did not cover her rent or her food. So while many of her peers were resting or socializing, this student worked full-time overnight shifts as an emergency medical technician. She worked on an ambulance from 9 at night until 5 in the morning, dealing with severe city traumas. And then she walked into my anatomy lab at 8 in the morning and scored perfectly on every single exam. She slept 3 hours a night. She survived on vending machine food. She literally almost worked herself to death because the people who were supposed to protect her decided she was not worth their signature. Tears instantly welled up in my eyes. Hearing my own agonizing struggle validated and spoken out loud by the woman I respected most in the world completely broke the dam I had built around my emotions. I covered my mouth with my trembling hand. But her absolute brilliance could not be hidden, Dr. Pierce said, her voice softening just a fraction. I hired her as my research assistant. I watched her become the sharpest, most dedicated surgical mind I have seen in 20 years of practicing medicine. She climbed from the bottom of her circumstances to become the absolute top student in this entire graduating class. She earned every single inch of this degree with her own blood, sweat, and tears. Dr. Pierce paused. She let the weight of the story settle over the 10,000 people in the crowd. The silence was heavy and profound. And then her expression hardened into pure ice. She looked right at the broadcasting camera, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective fury. "You would think," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone that somehow carried to the very back row of the stadium, "you would think that a family would be moving heaven and earth to be here today to witness that kind of triumph. You would think they would be begging for forgiveness and cheering the loudest. But they are not here. The 4 VIP seats allotted to this valedictorian are completely empty." The camera operators, sensing the massive dramatic tension, began to pan the lenses. I saw the red recording light of the massive crane camera swing directly toward my section. "Do you want to know why those seats are empty?" Dr. Pierce asked the crowd, pointing a finger directly at the camera. "Because David and Valerie Evans of Seattle, Washington, decided that their daughter's medical school graduation was not important enough to attend. They told her it was just a boring ceremony. Instead, David and Valerie Evans chose to take their younger daughter, Tiffany, on a luxury Caribbean cruise to celebrate the fact that she gained 10,000 followers on a social media app. They chose to drink margaritas by a pool rather than watch their eldest daughter become a doctor." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and explosive. 10,000 people let out a simultaneous noise of absolute disgust and shock. People were shaking their heads. Other parents in the grandstands were loudly booing, the sheer audacity of my family's cruelty. The dean of the medical school was staring at Dr. Pierce with his mouth hanging wide open. Nobody could believe that a keynote speaker had just publicly named and shamed a student's toxic family on a live university broadcast. Dr. Pierce ignored the chaos. She looked away from the camera and pointed directly at me. The massive jumbo screens above the football field instantly flashed to my face. I was sitting there in my dark green velvet robe, tears streaming freely down my cheeks, completely exposed to the world. "That student is sitting right there," Dr. Pierce said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. Dr. Clara Evans. The entire graduating class of medical students immediately turned to look at me. Dr. Pierce gripped the podium. "Dr. Evans, your biological parents may have chosen a cruise ship over your hooding ceremony. They may have tried to make you feel small and invisible. But look around you right now." I looked up at the stage. Dr. Pierce was smiling at me. It was a smile of pure, fierce maternal pride. "The entire medical community is your family now," she declared loudly over the speakers. "We see your brilliance. We see your sacrifice. We see exactly what you are worth. And we are so incredibly proud to call you our colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand up and show Dr. Clara Evans the respect she has earned today." What happened next was something I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. Dr. Caroline Pierce started clapping. Then the dean of the medical school stood up and started clapping. Within 5 seconds, the entire faculty on the stage was on their feet. Then the graduating students sitting around me stood up. And finally, 10,000 strangers in the grandstands rose to their feet. The stadium erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. The sound was like a physical wave crashing over me. It was a roaring, thunderous validation of every single tear I had shed, every single overnight shift I had worked, and every single time my parents had told me I was not enough. The students sitting next to me, people who barely knew me, were patting me on the back and cheering my name. I stood up. I was trembling so violently I could barely feel my legs. I looked up at the jumbo screen and saw my own face, tears shining in my eyes, surrounded by a sea of people applauding my survival. For 28 years, my parents had tried to erase me. They had tried to make me the invisible disappointment. But in that exact moment, standing in front of 10,000 people, I was the most visible person in the entire world. I had won. I had completely and totally won. But while I was experiencing the most beautiful, validating moment of my entire life, a massive, unstoppable disaster was quietly brewing thousands of miles away. Because the internet is a very fast and very unforgiving place. As the standing ovation finally began to die down and the ceremony proceeded, I sat back down in my chair and reached into the pocket of my robe to grab a tissue. My hand brushed against my cell phone. It was completely hot to the touch. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. My heart skipped a beat. I had 47 missed calls. I had over 200 unread text messages, and my phone was currently vibrating so violently in my hand, it felt like it was going to explode. I unlocked the screen and opened my messages. The live broadcast of the graduation ceremony had not just stayed within the university. The clip of Dr. Pierce calling out David and Valerie Evans of Seattle had already been screen recorded, clipped, and shared. It had made its way directly into the hands of my extended family, my father's corporate clients, and my mother's exclusive country club circle. The viral fallout had officially begun, and my toxic parents were entirely trapped on a cruise ship with incredibly slow internet, completely unaware that their flawless social reputation was currently being burned to the ground. I sat in the stadium chair, the heavy green velvet of my robe pooling around my ankles, staring down at my cell phone. The screen was completely overwhelmed. The notifications were rolling in so fast that the operating system was actually lagging. I had 47 missed calls. I had over 200 unread text messages. The little red notification bubbles on my social media apps were climbing into the thousands. I unlocked the screen, my hands still trembling from the massive standing ovation I had just received. I opened my text messages, expecting to see a few confused questions. What I found instead was a massive nuclear explosion of family drama. The live broadcast of the university hooding ceremony had not just stayed within the confines of the medical community. The video clip of Dr. Caroline Pierce looking directly into the camera and publicly calling out David and Valerie Evans of Seattle, had been instantly screen recorded by a student. It had been uploaded to social media. And because the internet loves absolutely nothing more than exposing arrogant, wealthy people, the algorithm had picked it up and pushed it directly into the viral stratosphere. It had made its way to Seattle in a matter of minutes. The first message I opened was from my Aunt Sarah. It was a massive block of text, sent entirely in capital letters. "Clara, please tell me this video is a joke," she wrote. "Please tell me your mother did not actually abandon you for a cruise today." Valerie told the entire family last week that medical school graduations were strictly restricted to students and faculty only because of stadium capacity. She told us you specifically asked them not to fly down because it was just a boring administrative formality. She swore to us that you gave your 2 VIP tickets to your professors. Did they really refuse to co-sign your student loans so Tiffany could start that stupid internet boutique? We are all watching the live stream right now. The entire family is completely horrified. Call me immediately. I stared at the message, the sheer audacity of my parents' lies finally washing over me. They had not just abandoned me. They had actively run a highly calculated public relations campaign back home in Seattle to ensure nobody knew what they had done. They had painted themselves as supportive, understanding parents who were simply respecting my wishes, all while sneaking off to a luxury cruise ship. I backed out of Aunt Sarah's message and opened the massive extended family group chat. It was an absolute bloodbath. My aunts, uncles, and older cousins were completely tearing my parents apart. Uncle Robert had sent a link to the viral video clip with a message that read, "I cannot believe I am related to people who would treat their own daughter this way. $50,000 for a fake lifestyle brand, but you let Clara work overnight on an ambulance. David and Valerie, you should be absolutely ashamed of yourselves." My cousins were chiming in, calling Tiffany a spoiled, entitled brat. People who had smiled at Tiffany's 10,000-follower balloon party just a week ago were now publicly demanding that my parents answer for their cruelty. But the fallout was not just contained to our family gossip circle. My father was a high-level corporate consultant. His entire career was built on the foundation of his pristine, trustworthy family man image. He consulted for massive financial firms, advising them on corporate ethics and public relations. I opened a professional networking app on my phone. The video of Dr. Pierce had already been posted there by several prominent medical professionals discussing the financial barriers in medical education. One of my father's biggest corporate clients had commented on the video. The comment simply said, "Is this the same David Evans who runs the Seattle consulting firm? If so, my company will be reviewing our current contracts. Integrity matters at home first." My father's entire professional reputation, the kingdom he had spent 30 years ruthlessly building, was currently burning to the ground in front of the entire world. And the greatest irony of all was that they were entirely trapped on a massive boat in the middle of the ocean. An hour passed. The graduation ceremony officially concluded. The stadium began to empty as thousands of happy families rushed onto the field to take pictures and celebrate. I was standing near the edge of the stage, holding my heavy leather diploma cover, when my phone suddenly vibrated with a completely different ringtone. The cruise ship must have finally docked at a port in the Bahamas, or they had finally purchased the premium high-speed satellite internet package, because a barrage of messages from my mother suddenly flooded my screen. I opened the text thread. There was no apology. There was no remorse. There was only the frantic, blind, narcissistic rage of a woman who had just realized her perfect mask had been completely ripped off. "Clara Evans, what on earth did you do?" my mother texted, the messages arriving back-to-back in rapid succession. "Your father's phone is exploding. His business partners are threatening to drop his consulting firm. Aunt Sarah is calling me a monster in the family group chat. How dare you embarrass us like this on a public live stream? You are ruining our family name. You need to fix this right now. You need to issue a public apology on your social media accounts immediately. Tell everyone that Dr. Pierce was completely lying. Tell them the $50,000 was a loan that Tiffany is paying back. Tell them you told us not to come to the graduation. Fix this, Clara, or your father is going to cut you out of this family forever." I stood there in the warm California sun, reading the frantic, desperate words of a woman who cared more about her country club status than she cared about her own daughter's survival. 10 years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a complete panic. I would have instantly drafted an apology. I would have taken the blame just to restore the peace. But I was not the scared, invisible 16-year-old girl eating cold chicken in the kitchen anymore. I had survived the overnight ambulance shifts. I had survived the brutal surgical rotations. I had earned the respect of the greatest medical minds in the country. I reached into the garment bag I had carried with me to the stadium. I unzipped it and pulled out the crisp, perfectly white doctor's coat. I slipped my arms into the sleeves. The fabric was heavy and immaculate. I looked down at the breast pocket. Stitched into the fabric in dark, elegant navy blue embroidery were the words, "Dr. Clara Evans, M.D., Department of Pediatric Surgery." I looked at my mother's text message demanding an apology. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to argue with her. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pity for them. They were so trapped in their shallow, fake reality that they could not even recognize the magnitude of what they had lost. I did not type a single word in response. I simply tapped the small information icon in the top right corner of her contact profile. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen. I pressed the button that said, "Block this caller." I went to my father's contact profile. I pressed block. I went to Tiffany's contact profile. I pressed block. I went into my email accounts, my social media profiles, and my professional networking pages, and I permanently blocked every single digital avenue they could possibly use to reach me. I cut the cord completely, cleanly, and without a single ounce of hesitation. I put my phone back into the pocket of my white coat. I took a deep breath of the fresh spring air. For the first time in 28 years, my chest did not feel tight. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations and their conditional love was entirely gone. I walked out of that massive stadium alone, but I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. I left them to drown in the public relations nightmare they had built with their own bare hands. That afternoon marked the beginning of my silent ascent. I completely left my past behind. I legally changed my last name to my grandmother's maiden name, Hayes, to completely sever any professional association with my father's disgraced consulting firm. I moved out of the state to begin my incredibly demanding surgical residency at one of the premier children's hospitals in the country. I threw myself entirely into my career. I specialized in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, which is widely considered one of the most complex, high-stakes, and unforgiving medical fields in the world. I spent my days operating on infants with severe heart defects, holding their tiny, fragile hearts in my hands, and literally giving them a second chance at life. Over the next 5 years, I built an absolutely untouchable professional reputation. I became the youngest attending surgeon in the history of my hospital department. I published groundbreaking clinical research on congenital valve repairs. I bought a beautiful, modern home overlooking the ocean. I built a fiercely loyal, deeply loving circle of friends who became my true chosen family. I achieved complete financial, emotional, and professional independence. During those 5 years of massive success, I maintained strict, absolute no contact with my biological family. I never unblocked their numbers. I never checked their social media pages. I simply let them fade into a distant, unpleasant memory. I occasionally heard rumors through a cousin who had also distanced herself from the family. The viral graduation video had done permanent damage to my father's career. Several major corporate clients had dropped his consulting firm, citing a lack of ethical alignment, forcing him to drastically downsize his business and their luxurious lifestyle. As for Tiffany, her grand influencer career had completely tanked. The internet quickly grew tired of her shallow, aesthetic posts, and her wellness boutique went completely bankrupt within a year, entirely draining the $50,000 my parents had stolen from my future. She ended up marrying a man who was just as arrogant and lazy as she was, a guy who could not hold down a steady job. They were currently living in my parents' guest bedroom, relying entirely on my father's dwindling savings to survive. They were a complete disaster, entirely trapped in a web of their own entitlement and financial ruin. And I was completely free of them. But the universe has an incredibly ironic sense of humor. Just when you think you have entirely closed a chapter, the universe will sometimes force the book wide open again, just to test your boundaries. 5 years after that explosive graduation ceremony, Tiffany gave birth to a baby girl. And shortly after her birth, the doctors discovered that my new niece had a severe, incredibly rare congenital heart defect. It was a condition so complex and so dangerous that the local surgeons in Seattle refused to operate. They told my terrified family that there was only one surgical team on the entire West Coast qualified to fix a defect of that magnitude. They arranged an emergency medical transport. My parents and Tiffany boarded a plane, completely panicked, desperate, and rushing toward the top pediatric cardiac center in the region. They were flying directly toward my hospital. And because I now operated exclusively under my legally changed name, Dr. Clara Hayes, they had absolutely no idea that the brilliant, highly sought-after specialist they were desperately relying on to save their baby's life was the exact same daughter they had abandoned for a cruise ship 5 years ago. The pediatric cardiothoracic surgical wing of a major hospital is a completely different world from the rest of the building. It is an environment built entirely on absolute precision, high stakes, and deafening silence. When you are dealing with the fragile, failing hearts of infants, there is absolutely no room for ego or hesitation. By my 5th year as an attending surgeon, I had completely mastered this environment. I operated under my legally changed name, Dr. Clara Hayes. To my colleagues and my patients, I was a brilliant, fiercely dedicated specialist who worked miracles on a daily basis. They knew absolutely nothing about the terrified, invisible girl from Seattle. I had built an impenetrable fortress around my new life, and I honestly believed that the heavy steel doors of my past were permanently locked forever. But toxic families are like a deeply dormant virus. Just when you think your system is completely clear of them, they find a way to violently resurface. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday morning in late November. I was sitting in my private office reviewing post-operative scans when my desk phone rang. It was the chief intake coordinator for the emergency neonatal transport unit. She told me that a critical life flight was currently inbound from a regional hospital in Seattle. A newborn baby girl had been delivered just 48 hours prior and was immediately diagnosed with a severe, highly complex congenital heart defect known as transposition of the great arteries. Essentially, the 2 main arteries leaving the baby's heart were completely reversed, pumping unoxygenated blood throughout her tiny body. It was a fatal condition without immediate, highly specialized surgical intervention. The local surgical teams in Washington state had taken one look at the echocardiogram and refused to operate. The defect was far too complex, and the infant was deteriorating rapidly. They told the terrified family that there was only one pediatric cardiac center on the entire West Coast with the survival statistics and the specific surgical expertise required to perform the arterial switch operation. They arranged an immediate emergency medical flight to our hospital in California. The intake coordinator told me the baby was 10 minutes out and that the family had flown down on a commercial flight and was currently waiting in the 3rd-floor surgical consultation room. I asked her to send the digital medical file to my tablet so I could review the specific anatomical structures before the baby arrived in the operating room. 2 minutes later, my tablet chimed. I opened the secure medical file. I bypassed the clinical notes and looked directly at the patient demographic information at the top of the screen. Patient name, baby girl Evans. Mother, Tiffany Evans. Accompanying next of kin, David Evans and Valerie Evans. I stopped breathing. The air in my private office suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I stared at the glowing screen of my tablet, my eyes tracking over those names again and again, waiting for the letters to magically rearrange themselves into something else. But they did not change. It was them. My sister, Tiffany, had given birth to a baby with a failing heart, and the Seattle doctors had blindly sent her directly into the hands of the single most qualified surgeon in the region, Dr. Clara Hayes. Because I had completely severed all contact 5 years ago and legally changed my last name, my parents had absolutely no idea that the brilliant savior they were flying hundreds of miles to see was the exact same daughter they had abandoned to go on a luxury cruise. I placed my tablet face down on my desk. I did not panic. I did not cry. My surgical training completely overrode my emotional shock. I reached over to my computer monitor and pulled up the live security camera feed for the third-floor surgical waiting area. I needed to see what I was walking into. The high-definition video popped onto my screen, and there they were. 5 years had passed, but they had not changed a single bit. Their sheer, arrogant entitlement was practically vibrating through the camera lens. My father, David, was pacing furiously back and forth across the waiting room. He was wearing an expensive designer sweater, holding his phone to his ear, and aggressively pointing his finger at the poor triage nurse behind the desk. Even without audio, I could tell exactly what he was doing. He was dropping names. He was demanding VIP treatment. He was treating the incredibly stressful environment of a neonatal intensive care waiting room like the lobby of a hotel that had lost his reservation. My mother, Valerie, was sitting on a vinyl couch, clutching her expensive leather handbag. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the devastated, wealthy grandmother while simultaneously glaring at the other terrified families in the room as if they were taking up her personal breathing space. And sitting entirely slumped in a corner chair was Tiffany. She looked completely helpless, staring blankly at the wall. The internet influencer who had built a massive fake reality of perfect aesthetic wellness was now facing a genuine, horrifying medical crisis, and she had absolutely no idea how to handle it. They were all waiting for an older, distinguished, likely male surgeon to walk through those doors, shake my father's hand, and assure them that their money and their status would guarantee their baby's survival. They expected the world to bend to their will, just like it always had. They expected a savior. I looked at the terrified family on the security monitor. 5 years ago, the thought of facing them would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have felt the overwhelming urge to shrink myself, to apologize for existing, to beg for their approval. But as I watched my father yell at the triage nurse, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical resolve. They had absolutely no power here. This was my hospital. This was my surgical wing, and more importantly, there was an innocent newborn baby currently flying through the sky who desperately needed my hands to survive. I stood up from my desk. I walked over to the coat hook on the back of my door and took down my pristine white lab coat. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the fabric against my shoulders. I looked down at the dark navy blue embroidery on the chest. Dr. Clara Hayes, head of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. I picked up the baby's medical chart, opened my office door, and began the long walk down the brightly lit hospital corridor toward the third-floor consultation room. Every single step I took echoed against the polished linoleum floor, a steady, rhythmic countdown to the greatest confrontation of my entire life. I walked past the nurses' station, and the staff automatically parted ways for me, offering respectful nods. "Morning, Dr. Hayes," one of the surgical residents whispered as I passed. I simply nodded back, my face locked into an expression of absolute, unyielding professionalism. I reached the heavy frosted glass doors of the private surgical consultation suite. Through the translucent glass, I could see the blurry outlines of my parents and my sister sitting around the small conference table. I could hear my father's muffled voice complaining about the lack of premium coffee in the waiting area. I placed my hand flat against the cold metal push bar of the door. I took one final, deep breath, perfectly compartmentalizing 28 years of childhood trauma into a locked box in the back of my mind. Then, I pushed the heavy glass doors wide open and stepped into the room. The hinges were completely silent, but my entrance commanded immediate attention. My father, my mother, and Tiffany all snapped their heads toward the door, their eyes wide with desperate anticipation. They looked at my white coat first. Then they looked at the medical chart in my hands. And finally, their eyes moved up to my face. I want to describe exactly what happens when the human brain is confronted with a visual reality that completely shatters its established worldview. It does not happen instantly. There is a 2-second delay where the brain desperately tries to reject the information it is receiving. My mother Valerie stopped breathing. Her perfectly manicured hands froze in midair. All the color instantly drained out of her face, leaving her looking completely gray and hollow under the harsh, fluorescent hospital lights. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. My father David literally took a step backward. His jaw dropped open, entirely stripping away his arrogant corporate persona. His eyes darted wildly around the small room, as if he were looking for hidden cameras. He looked at my face, then down at the embroidered name on my coat, and then back up to my face, his brain completely short-circuiting. Tiffany remained sitting in her chair, her hands covering her mouth. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely made a sound. "You are the head surgeon." I did not offer a warm smile. I did not step forward to embrace them. I stood perfectly straight, my posture radiating the absolute authority of a woman who controlled the room. "I am Dr. Hayes," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely professional. "I am the attending pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, and I have reviewed your daughter's echocardiogram." The sound of my voice, calm and authoritative, seemed to violently snap them out of their initial shock. But instead of feeling shame or remorse for the horrific way they had treated me 5 years ago, my mother's deeply ingrained narcissism instantly kicked in. She saw my white coat, she saw my authority, and she immediately tried to leverage our biological connection to secure the VIP treatment they believed they were entitled to. She jumped up from the vinyl couch, tears streaming down her face, and completely changed her entire narrative in a fraction of a second. She spread her arms wide, attempting to rush across the room to pull me into a deeply emotional, theatrical hug. "Oh, Clara, thank God," she sobbed loudly, her voice echoing in the small room. "Thank God it is you. It is family. You are going to save your little niece. We are so incredibly sorry about the past. We really are. We always knew you were going to be a brilliant doctor. You have to help us, Clara. You have to give Tiffany the best care possible. We need a private recovery room, and your father wants to be updated every single hour during the surgery." She was less than 2 feet away from me, her arms reaching out to claim the exact same daughter she had once called a financial liability and a boring disappointment. She was trying to completely erase decades of abuse with a single, manipulative embrace simply because she needed something from me. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I simply raised my right hand, holding my palm flat out in front of me like a solid brick wall, stopping her dead in her tracks. My mother physically jolted, halting her dramatic approach. She looked at my raised hand, completely stunned that I was refusing to play the role of the obedient, forgiving daughter. My father puffed out his chest, his anger instantly flaring up to protect his wife. "Clara, put your hand down," he snapped, his voice reverting back to the arrogant tone he used to discipline me when I was a teenager. "You cannot speak to your mother like that. We are your family. We are in a crisis right now, and you are going to treat us with respect." I lowered my hand. I looked at the 3 of them, standing in my hospital, demanding special treatment, demanding forgiveness, and demanding that I instantly forget the agonizing pain they had caused me, simply because it was convenient for them. The trap was perfectly set, and it was finally time to deliver the absolute, devastating checkmate. I kept my right hand raised flat in the air between us. The silence in the small consultation room was so absolute that you could hear the faint mechanical hum of the hospital ventilation system. My mother, Valerie, stared at my hand as if it were a physical weapon. For my entire life, she had used physical affection and emotional warmth as a highly conditional currency. She only dispensed it when I had done something to increase her neighborhood social standing, and she violently withdrew it the second I became an inconvenience to her perfect aesthetic. She honestly believed she could simply turn the faucet of a mother's love back on and wash away 28 years of deliberate neglect with a single theatrical hug. "Put your arms down," I said quietly. The temperature in my voice dropped the room by 10 degrees. "We are not doing this today. We are not going to pretend that the last 5 years did not happen just because you are suddenly terrified and sitting inside my hospital." My father, David, instantly felt his absolute authority slipping away. He stepped directly in front of my mother, puffing out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me exactly like he used to do when I was a teenager begging for college tuition. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He was a man who was entirely used to buying his way out of every single consequence. He was used to intimidating waiters, bullying junior executives, and controlling his daughters with the constant threat of financial ruin. But standing in my surgical wing, stripped of his checkbook and his corporate leverage, he was completely powerless. "Clara," he barked, his voice vibrating with a familiar toxic rage, "you lower your hand right now and you show your mother some respect. We flew halfway across the country because your newborn niece is dying. We are your family. You are going to treat us like VIPs. You are going to get us a private waiting suite, and you are going to fix this baby immediately. Do you understand me?" I looked at the man who had laughed at my dreams and coldly refused to co-sign my medical school loans. He was trying to command a head surgeon in her own cardiothoracic department. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away. I simply looked at him with the exact same cold clinical detachment that I usually reserved for examining a diseased organ. "I am going to save this baby," I stated, my voice echoing firmly off the frosted glass walls. "I am going to save her because I took a sacred medical oath to preserve human life, and she is an innocent child who desperately needs a highly skilled surgeon. But let us get one thing perfectly and absolutely clear right now. I am doing this as a medical professional. I am not doing this as your daughter, and I am certainly not doing this as your family." Tiffany let out a loud, shuddering sob from her vinyl chair. She looked at me, her eyes wide with absolute terror, finally realizing that the quiet, invisible sister she had mocked and belittled for her entire life now held the literal beating heart of her newborn baby in her hands. The golden child internet influencer had zero power here. I looked directly at Tiffany, then back to my furious parents. "Here are the rules," I said, ticking them off on my fingers. "You will not get a private VIP suite. You will sit down the hall in the standard communal surgical waiting room, just like every other terrified family in this hospital. You will not receive hourly personalized updates from me. You will get the standard updates from the surgical nursing staff. And once this operation is over and the baby is medically stabilized, you are completely banned from my private clinical practice. You will follow up with one of my junior colleagues. You lost the privilege of my personal time 5 years ago." My father was practically vibrating with indignation. "You cannot do this to us," he yelled, taking another threatening step forward. "You cannot treat us like strangers. You are our daughter. You are a doctor. You have an ethical obligation to us." I looked at him. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I thought back to the exact text message my mother had sent me from the sunny deck of that luxury cruise ship, while I sat completely alone in a stadium of 10,000 people. The trap was perfectly set, and I delivered the absolute, devastating checkmate. "Why do you care how I treat you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "After all, It is not like I am really a doctor yet anyway. I still have to finish my residency, right? The words hit them like a physical freight train. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with both hands as the memory of her own cruel text message violently crashed down on her. My father's mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by his own recycled cruelty. They had absolutely nothing left to say. Their own arrogance had completely destroyed their leverage. I turned my back on them. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the consultation room and walked out into the brightly lit hallway. I did not look back to see them crying. I walked straight to the surgical scrub room. I stood in front of the stainless steel sink, letting the steaming hot water and the harsh antibacterial soap wash over my hands and forearms. I systematically scrubbed away the lingering shadows of my childhood. When I walked into operating room 4, the bright surgical lights were shining down on the tiny, fragile chest of my newborn niece. I blocked out her last name. I blocked out her mother's face. The operating room was freezing cold, exactly the way I prefer it. The rhythmic, steady beeping of the heart monitors was the only sound in the room. For the next 8 hours, I performed one of the most grueling, microscopically precise arterial switch operations of my entire career. I detached the tiny aorta and pulmonary artery, transposing them to their correct anatomical positions, and carefully relocated the microscopic coronary arteries. It was a flawless symphony of medical science. And when I finally stepped back from the operating table and peeled off my surgical gloves, the baby's heart was beating perfectly. It was pink, healthy, and completely repaired. I had done exactly what I promised to do. I did not go to the waiting room to deliver the good news. I instructed the head surgical nurse to go tell the Evans family that the procedure was a complete success and that the surgeon had already left the hospital for the day. I went to the locker room, changed into my street clothes, walked out to my car, and drove back to my beautiful home overlooking the ocean. I never saw them again. The hospital administration enforced my boundaries perfectly. The baby made a full recovery and was discharged a month later under the care of a different physician. My parents and my sister flew back to their miserable, failing lives in Seattle, knowing for the rest of their lives that they owed the survival of their child to the exact same woman they had tried to completely erase. If we look at this story through a psychological lens, we have to talk about the deeply toxic concept of conditional self-worth. For the first 20 years of my life, I genuinely believed that my value as a human being was entirely dependent on my parents' approval. I thought that if I just achieved enough, if I just shrank myself enough to make them comfortable, if I just absorbed enough of their abuse, they would eventually love me. But the brutal reality of toxic family dynamics is that the goalpost will always be moved. You can literally become a world-class surgeon, and they will still find a way to make you feel like a massive disappointment if it serves their narrative. True family is not defined merely by shared DNA or the obligatory ties of blood. Family is genuinely defined by the people who consistently show up for you, who celebrate your victories instead of tearing them down, and who offer unconditional acceptance when you need it most. When you finally decide to walk away from a toxic environment, establishing strict boundaries is never an act of petty revenge. Boundaries are not selfish. They are self-respect. They are a necessary, ironclad wall that declares exactly where your new life begins and where their damage finally ends. You have every absolute right to quietly build your own empire, choose your own family, and deny access to anyone who only recognizes your value once it becomes a matter of life and death. Your worth is determined by what you build when no one is watching, and by who you become when everyone counts you out. The profound and powerful lesson we can learn from this unforgettable, triumphant journey, fraught with betrayal and redemption, is that your core values are never determined by the flawed and arrogant individuals who abandoned you when you needed them most. Because for far too long, many of us have been imprisoned by the toxic illusion of conditional self-worth, a deeply damaging belief that we must diminish ourselves, sacrifice our futures, and endure calculated abuse to gain a fraction of fleeting approval from parents who see our accomplishments as inconvenient burdens to their shallow reality. However, the moment you realize the truth that your biological DNA doesn't guarantee someone an undisputed seat at your family's dinner table, you'll empower yourself to redefine what family truly means, recognizing that genuine love is never about exchange and that your real family consists entirely of those who see your radiance even when you're exhausted, who celebrate your victories instead of destroying them, and who offer unconditional support without demanding you sacrifice yourself to warm their hearts. This ultimately proves that setting firm boundaries is never a petty act of revenge, but an absolute statement of self-respect and a necessary fortress to protect your peace. That means you have every right to quietly build your own empire, become the savior of your own story, and permanently reject those who only recognize your value when it suddenly becomes a matter of life and death. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If you found strength, validation, or hope in this story of setting boundaries and reclaiming your personal power, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and join our growing community here at Sophia Told Stories. We will always continue to share powerful narratives about surviving toxic families and thriving entirely on your own terms. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you had to enforce a difficult boundary for your own peace of mind. I read every single one. Take care of yourself out there, and I will see you in the next story.